Hey everybody, this is some Christian guy, and today is going to be my first part in the guideline that was released by the APA. So for those of you that are back for more, if the other half didn't bore the absolute living hell out of you, I'm now going to go through the first guideline that you can see here. For which was released by the American Psychological Association with regards to the treatment of men and boys. So let's crack on because there's a lot to go through. Right. So the guideline, it goes basically guideline, rationale, and then at the end of rationale they have basically they give you their application, how it's intended to be applied. So we're gonna go sort of basically through that and just have a bit of a chat about it. Right. So the first guideline is basically, it says psychologists strive to recognize that masculinities, now we already dealt with what they mean by masculinities in the introduction, are constructed based on social, cultural, and contextual norms. So it's absolute garbage, but based on what they previously said and those prior assumptions that we did in their introduction, that and we completely refuted that. Where they believe that all the different expressions of masculinity, in other words, all the different ways in which individual men express themselves as men, right? Whether hypermasculine or whether a bit more cerebral, or the case might be, that those are all social and cultural contextual norms, which is absolute garbage. We discussed about the biological roots of that, and basically society, the social and the cultural is responding to the biological and not the other way around. And also, it is true, however, that depending on the culture, right, the different certain types of male expression will be preferred, right? So the culture does not create the man to be a certain way, but from the selection of men that are available, they will select the men which are the most useful to that particular culture in that particular context. So to make a fairly simple example, if you go back 1,000 years or whatever the case might be, hunter-gatherer society, what would be the most desirable traits that people would find in men? And that would be men who are good hunters, for example, and men who are good warriors, because things were very tribal and so on and so forth, and that is sort of what the ideal man would be. And so men who didn't sort of fit those sort of criteria would have been relegated, would have either been sort of not particularly desirable, or would have been sort of relegated to sort of other duties within the culture, sort of thing. And then as the men get older, they transition from, say, hunters and warriors, and they would transition to become elders and things of that sort. So men who were maybe not necessarily very, very strong in terms of hunting and in terms of warfare would have then maybe been more valued if they were intelligent and things of that sort. If they were stoic and rational and all these kinds of things, they would have been maybe shamans or elders and things of that sort, the thinkers of the culture. And it hasn't changed much from today. Right, we like the intelligent people to go into the sciences, and they should go into politics, but it seems like we only get idiots in politics. And and then those who are very, very physically dominant, for the most part, actually in the culture today, they basically serve for our entertainment. So they go into sports, and or they go into the military. So they go, so then they are either our entertainment or they are our defense. And so the defense role has basically stayed the same throughout time. So here's their rationale. They're now going to try and substantiate why why they believe this, right? That to strive to recognize that masculinities are constructed based on cultural and contextual norms, all right? And that's it, right? So there is still no mention of biology whatsoever, right? The following, it says here, right? Clinical awareness of one's stereotypes and biases against boys and men is a critical dimension of multicultural competence. They've literally been nothing but completely biased up to this point, right? Against one type of masculine expression, right? Nothing, right? Basically toxic masculinity and whatever. Completely biased against that. But it's like, oh man, it's it's like someone that while being completely irrational tells someone else it's very important to be rational, right? But unless you agree with them, then you're being irrational. Completely ridiculous. They don't understand their own presuppositions and their own anything here, to be honest. Understanding the socially, again, there we go, socially constructed nature of masculinity and how it affects boys and men, as well as psychologists, also is an important cultural competency. Now, to a degree, I can agree with that, right? Um, Basically, understanding the kinds of pressures that the culture puts on an individual is obviously very, very important, right? But the nature of masculinity is not socially constructed, right? So this is wordplay here, this is obfuscation and things like that. The culture, the social world does not dictate biology, right? It responds to biology, and then from the available biological manifestations, it then wants to select that which is preferable. And now it is absolutely true that, for example, if a particular culture favors a certain type of man, then obviously the men who don't fit that ideal are going to struggle, right? It's that simple. And you get the same thing with women, right? So for example, most people don't like fat women, right? And so fat women in a society that prefers lean, fit, healthy woman is, they're gonna have problems. They're gonna, for whatever the case reason might be. And so you see this insanity of this, all the fat shaming and all that kind of stuff. Beautiful at any size, healthy at any size, which is utter garbage, right? But you can see that there's a psychological, they snap basically, and they go insane. And it is true that in those senses we must be careful that even though we prefer one thing, we must not make people who don't fit an ideal feel less, like they're worthless and things of that sort. You just shouldn't treat people badly in general. And so it is true that people do that, right? Now, where was I? Here we go. So it says here, it is common to use the term masculinities rather than masculinity. No, it's not common. First of all, it is not common. This is garbage. People just talk about masculinity, and under that falls all the different things, right? They're basically trying to change the language here. Whenever someone tries to change the language, right? Whenever people try to change it, like for example, social justice, right? You have justice. That's it, right? When people start adding little prefixes and things like that, there's an agenda, okay? So when people start screwing around with the language, then there's immediately, that's an alarm bell. There's something going on here, right? So the term masculinities rather than masculinity, to acknowledge the various conceptions of masculine gender roles associated with an intersection of multiple identities. Holy cow. Word salad, man. So we dealt with intersectionality in the previous thing, and masculine gender roles. So basically what we generally expect men of a certain kind to do. So for example, if you have a weedy, nerdy guy, you sort of tend to expect him to be into computers and stuff. So we stereotype people in certain ways, right? And here's the thing, right? Even though stereotypes are not always accurate, right? So you can see someone who's a bit weedy and whatever the case might be, and wearing glasses, for example, and you might immediately stereotype him as nerdy, as computer oriented, maybe very intelligent, whatever the case might be. And it might be totally false. He might absolutely hate computers, and he might be as thick as a post, right? But the reason why stereotypes are basically generalizations, right? It's exactly the same thing. And the reason why stereotypes or generalizations exist is the fact of the matter that the vast majority of people within a population clump under certain types of things. So for example, you find men who are very, very muscular and very dominant and all these kinds of things. Even though it is not true that they're all a bunch of brainless idiots, But the propensity of brainless idiots within that category, is sufficient to give you the impression that most of them are. And so by assuming, right, because as human beings, when we're dealing with society, we sometimes have to deal with assumptions because the world is too complicated, right? So we start out with an assumption, right, and then we refine our opinion as we go along and interact with whatever it is. And the problem with people is not the assumption, right? It's not the assumption, it's not the stereotype or the generalization, but the fact that that the opinion that they first have, they never bother refining them, and in order to match the individual that they're talking to, right? That's where the problem is. But because there's, so for example, let's take example, if we go back to personality trait theory. In personality trait theory, it says that the vast majority of men are disagreeable. So if you approach most men as if they're disagreeable, then in the vast majority of chances, you are going to be dealing with a guy in an immediately correct way, right? And it minimizes the complexity of interpersonal relations, right? And then if the person turns out to be more agreeable than you thought, well, then that's a good thing, right? So here we are. So they give an example, right, in the multiple identities. All right, now this example is so idiotic, right? They say, rural working class adult white masculinities may take a different form than urban teenage Mexican masculinities. Yeah, well, no duh. I mean, first of all, how the hell do you compare an adult with a teenager? First of all, right? We know that we change, right? You've got a testosterone, you've sort of got a bit of a bell curve for testosterone. When a male hits puberty, testosterone skyrockets. They hit their peak at about 18 in their late teens, early 20s, and then sort of about mid 20s, late 20s, the curve of the testosterone curve starts to decrease, and men start to chill out. They start to become a bit more cerebral, a little bit more mature, a little bit more chilled out, whereas they might have been completely insane risk takers and things like that. So first of all, you can't compare an adult with a teenager, first of all, and second of all, to assume that a white masculinity is going to be different from Mexican is utter garbage. Is completely utter garbage. Why? Because whites and Mexicans have the same damn biology, right? They're subject to the same personality trait profile and etc. etc. It's the personality trait theory. The reason why it's so powerful is because it is true no matter what society you're in, and that's a biological assessment of people. So this idea here, they're basically, the reason why they say want to refer to white or Mexican, right? And then I mean they saw white and Mexican. It's like, well, white what, right? White Italian, white Scandinavian, white Portuguese. Which one, right? So over here they can be as racist and as they like, right? Because one of the complaints is like, oh, white people can't differentiate between black people, right? So if you assume that a person from Jamaica is from Africa, oh, what an offense, okay? What an absolute offense, right? But the fact of the matter is, when it comes to white people, you can just say they're all white, and these people never bother making a distinction between a white person from Norway or a white person from Latvia or whatever the case might be, right? So totally and utterly moronic. And even though the cultures are different, and the cultures based on their locale, right, in the world, and whatever tastes have been inculcated into the culture, right? They might prefer some types of males to other males, but the fact that a white man from wherever is going to be completely worlds apart from a Mexican man or a Mexican male is outside of the cultural idiosyncrasies is completely and utterly idiotic. It's completely utterly idiotic, right? And if white people were so utterly different, then you have to then explain why third world people, right, are moving to the West en masse and being more successful in the West than what they were where they come from. I'm an example of that, right? Okay, I was born in Brazil, Rio de Janeiro. I lived in South Africa for a while, and I said, this is not working. I came to live in the UK. Fantastic. right? And the fact that the British are culturally different to me is completely and utterly irrelevant, because I want the same thing the British guys want, right? And that's just to be able to be left the hell alone by your government, to be able to work, be prosperous, have a family, etc., etc. There's no difference. So, utterly idiotic example. Certain forms of masculinities are more socially central and associated with authority, social power, and influence. Now, this is true, right? This is true. So, for example, setting aside their masculinities definition, which is retarded, the fact of the matter is some men are more socially central and associated with authority, social power, and influence. So, for example, a man, an alpha male, right, is socially centered, right? And he's very dominant. But if you look at the social sexual hierarchy, you have alpha male at the top. You have alpha males and you have sigma males. Alpha males are very, very social. They like to be within the social hierarchy, and they have their cliques and they have their groups and stuff like that. Whereas then the sigma male is also at the top of the hierarchy, but he's outside. He's the lone wolf. He's independent and all that kind of stuff. So there are these differences, right? And the fact of the matter is, society does value sigma males. So, for example, a perfect example of a sigma male, right? So, an alpha male will be someone, let's say, like David Beckham, right? And or some stupid pop star, wherever they are, right? And they basically, every girl on the planet basically wets her panties over the guy. Okay, that's an alpha male, and he's part of a social hierarchy. He's very successful, whatever the case might be. Okay. Some band or whatever the case, right? Then a sigma male is also very, very dominant, but a sigma male will be like the guy in prison who's murdered. Extreme example, right? Like a Ted Bundy type. Actually, no. That's wrong. So like some biker guy, right? Some leader of a biker gang, for example, right? Some leader of a biker gang is in prison, right? And because he went and whatever. Now that biker guy, right, will get about 1 million times more women than the average law-abiding man on the street, right? So we often get with these serial killers get thousands and thousands of love letters from women all around the world, basically worshipping the guys and wanting to marry him. Okay, so why? Because he's dominant. He's a bad boy, you know, kind of thing, right? And women love that. Millions and millions of women love that. And every time there's some complete utter sociopath that ends up in prison for having done something completely ridiculous, I mean, the guy basically, there's always a horde of women ready to completely worship at this guy's feet, okay, and be like his little harem. So, you know, that's just one of those things, man. So, socially central, yes, but not all, and associated with authority. So, for example, again, an alpha male will have authority, and this guy might have authority in whatever sort of criminal outside of the social hierarchy system, right? That he maybe is a mob boss or something like that, right? Authority and social power and influence, right? So, and now here's the thing, right? What the two will have in common, right? What the two will have in common is both of them will be very, very high in extroversion, specifically trait assertiveness. Both of them will be very, very low in neuroticism, and so the difference is that the guy in prison will probably be quite high in volatility, right? Because, you know, you look at him funny and everything kicks off, okay? So he'll probably be high in volatility, but he'll be very, very low in withdrawal, okay? And then the alpha male, sort of the whatever the guy might be, will also then tend to, or the businessman, like a Donald Trump, will be very, very low in trait neuroticism, because to have that kind of a position where people constantly going off at you, you wouldn't be able to last if you weren't really, really, really low in trait neuroticism. But obviously not all men are like that, and not all men can be in that sort of limelight and do that sort of thing, right? So this is basically a truism. It's like, yeah, okay, that's true, but, you know, who the hell cares, right? So what? Now, I made a mess up here. Let's go back. Right. So it says here, in Western culture, so this is American, so they're referring to America mostly, and Western culture in general. So this, they would probably assume that this pertains to like Australia, the UK, etc. Right? In Western culture, the dominant ideal of masculinity has moved from an upper-class aristocratic image to a more rugged, self-sufficient ideal, and this is likely very true. I would personally agree with this. So aristocratic, there's a lot of if you think about upper class aristocratic, think about sort of old English gentry kind of thing, right? And people don't really like that anymore. So people like rugged and self-sufficient. So think of someone like Bear Grylls out there in the wild, eating cockroaches and chopping down trees and stuff like that, right? That's the ideal, okay? And self-sufficient. So a guy that can he can handle his business. He's got good so he can fix a car and all these kinds of things. So basically, a guy that's self-sufficient means he's useful, okay, rather than an aristocrat who's basically a mooch on society, okay. Even though they're dominant, but they sort of weasel their way up into a place of power and basically become leeches on society. So royalty, things like that, politicians, people don't like that. That's not the ideal male, right? People hate politicians in general, right? So they prefer the down to earth guy, the guy that's running around in the wild fishing and or who can bang together a cupboard out of wood and so on and so forth. Thus, traditional masculinity ideology can be viewed as the dominant, referred to as hegemonic, form of masculinity that strongly influences what members of a culture take to be normative. Again, this is garbage. It's not what the members of a culture take to be normative. It's what members of a culture take to be preferable. Okay? It's not what they're taking to be normal. It's what they prefer. No one ever says that it's normal for a man to be. In fact, a lot of the people today are readily acknowledge that most men are these useless little skinny jean latte sipping beta males that are basically good for nothing, right? So it's not about what we take to be normal. It's about what we take to be preferable, and even what women take to be preferable, right? Because a lot of women now. I've been a youth leader at churches and stuff like that, and I cannot tell you how many times I've had women come to me say, Morgan, we don't know what to do because there's no decent men out there, right? And when these girls are saying decent men, they're not saying that all men are bullies and rapists, and they're saying decent men as in there's no masculine, self-sufficient, reliable, useful, competent men out there, right? They're all a bunch of pansies. There's basically what they're saying for the most part. Prescriptions and proscriptions for behaviors that either align with or contradict the dominant ideal of masculinity are not linear, uniform, or without resistance. Yeah, well, duh. Okay, people prefer and change and chop. Human beings are complex. Duh. Right? Psychologists didn't know this already, then they shouldn't be practicing. Many men are socialized by friends, family, peers. So yeah, socialized by friends, family, peers, and society. Yeah, fair enough. So if you look at psychology, you'll find out the child is born, they have their personality set at birth. End of story. All right. And now, by the time the child hits about 4 or 5 years old, you need to socialize them. Okay, play with other children, whatever the case might be. If you see that your child is a bit introverted, then they need a little bit of extra encouragement to go out and learn how to play nicely with others, right? Because if you don't do that, chances are your child will grow up to be maladjusted, socially awkward, and probably will become abusive and things like that, right? So what these wonderful psychologists, which should know this, had any brains, they would realize that the reason why men become bad is not because society tells them to be bad. It's because they're not properly socialized as children, right? And why? Let's think about this. What could be causing so many men to be poorly socialized in their childhood? I wonder. I wonder if it has anything to do with single-parent families, or the breakdown of the family unit, or the fact that the justice system is completely against men, the divorce system completely against men. Men rarely ever get to have any kind of custody, even joint custody, so that the children can be exposed to their fathers, etc., etc., etc. All right. So they're not being socialized, right? Duh, right? And who are the most badly adjusted members of Western society? Those would be blacks and those would be Latinos, right? And if you look at those two populations, you will find out that they have the absolute highest rates of single parent homes, broken homes, etc., 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 right? So the number of bastard children in Latino and black societies is astronomical, right? Absolutely astronomical. Do you not think that that's going to be a problem? So they're admitting that men are socialized by their environment, right? But it's not the environment that makes them aggressive. Men are naturally aggressive, and they need to be socialized to bring out that aggression in a positive way, right? But if they're just left like animals to pasture, which is what when you have a broken home, when you have single parent households and things like that, and basically boys are just like left like animals to pasture, then they're gonna behave like animals. I mean, what the hell do you think, right? It's not because society is telling them to be that way, right? Although there is something to be said about rap music and this gangster garbage, right? This gangster idiot culture, right? Because then people try to emulate that and all that sort of thing, but you're not allowed to say anything about those cultures because black people are a protected group, so you can never say anything about that, right? And rock and roll, same garbage in a lot of ways. And most of it these people would support. So, and society, adhering to media, and so this they've got correct. Adhering to media portrayals of gender conformity, not gender conformity. Right? I mean, come on. If you look at the media today, right? LGBT people are like what, 2-3%, and yet they're disproportionately represented in all media. Try and watch anything these days where there isn't some sort of gay or lesbian individual in there, right? You would think that they were like half the damn population at this point, right? To adopt traditional masculine ideals, behaviors, and attitudes. Again, there's no such thing as traditional masculine anything. It's what men and women prefer in other individuals, right? And even women, right? Women don't want wimps, right? Women may absolutely love to hang around with their camp little gay friend and go shopping and all that kind of stuff. But that's not who they're going to marry now, is it? Okay? Yet for some men, this dominant ideology of masculinity has inherent conflicts. For instance, okay, so before we go there, it is true, like if you go in a particular school setting, the jocks tend to pick on the little nerdy guys, right? And so do the women, okay? The queen bee, head of cheerleaders, the women pick on the guys too, I mean, it's just that simple, right? We've all been there in school where we see this kind of thing play out, right? So it is true that whatever society prefers, so you've got a range of male personalities, and people prefer the strong male personalities to the weaker male personalities. And it is true that if a man has a weaker personality, he's going to have a hard time of it, right? That is absolutely true. But that's not society. It's not society that made the one that way or made the other that way. This is their biological, this is their personality traits, right? And what they need to be discussing instead is looking at people's personality traits and giving them a therapy or whatever the case might be, or getting people to understand that all the personality traits have their benefits. Now, let's say, for example, a guy who is hypermasculine, he will be very high in assertiveness and probably low in agreeableness, right? What we should rather be saying is, don't stop being assertive and don't necessarily stop being disagreeable, because both things are good in the right place and the right time. But as a part of the maturing process, a man, if he's disagreeable, needs to learn to become agreeable. And a man, if he's assertive, he needs to learn how to hold back and give other people a chance, right? So if I take myself, for example, if you look at my personality profile, I am in the 90 something percentile of assertiveness, and it's one of the things I've had to learn to hold back and let other people have a chance with things. And I'm also a bit disagreeable, so I've had to learn to become more agreeable. And part of how I managed to learn that was by getting married to a wonderful woman that taught me these things, right? So men, go out and get married to a woman. Do not think that you can go through life and be well adjusted if you don't have a decent woman. A bad woman is going to drive you to suicide. But get a good woman, right? And so that's true of those men on the one thing. But then men who are on the other spectrum, who are a little bit who are generally considered weaker. So those will be men who are typically very, very agreeable, maybe a little bit high in neuroticism and low in assertiveness. Whilst those things are okay, right? Because I had to learn to hold back my assertiveness and to be more agreeable. So the man who's very agreeable, he's already naturally agreeable. But then opposite to me, right, I have to learn to be more agreeable. He would have to learn to be more disagreeable when the circumstance calls for it. And that is what makes you a well-adjusted individual, right? So if you see a man who's maybe too agreeable and gets taken advantage of, maybe a little bit, and gets bullied a little bit, then the question is, right, obviously people shouldn't be bullied. But the fact of the matter is that in the real world, bad things happen all the time. You can't always be there to protect people. So the best thing you can do is then teach a guy who's getting picked on, teach him to fend for himself and to be a bit more assertive and things like that, and his whole life will change and his life will improve that way. This is actually this psychological garbage is actually a sin, because what it's going to do is going to take the men who are weak and men who are, so it wants to destroy men who are masculine and assertive, right? So that the whole population is a bunch of weak pansy men. And the problem is it takes a man who's weak and vulnerable, right, and it's going to just leave him that way, right? The object is not to leave a man that way, right, weak and vulnerable and stuff, but teach him to be a little bit more something, right? And to take the man who's a bit overly assertive and a bit overly aggressive, to how to rein that in and apply it properly for the benefit of society. It's to integrate, right? Integrate masculinity, not to downplay the one while uplifting the other, and basically the imbalance remains. Yet for some men, this dominant ideology of masculinity has inherent conflicts. Yeah, so for sure. For instance, so they're giving an example, right? For instance, dominant masculinity was historically predicated on the exclusion of men who were not white. So let's go this over here. Who were not white, heterosexual, cisgender, able-bodied, and privileged. So historically, and so they're obviously referring to back in the days when there was slavery, and even just after slavery, where blacks were having a bit of a rough time. So in that society, in the American society, basically, if you were white, if you were heterosexual, etc., people would lift you up and say you're the greatest and whatever. And anyone who didn't sort of match that had a really tough time of it, right? Which is true. We can't deny that, which is true. And here's the thing, that it's not just Western society. If you go to Africa, and I've lived in Africa, or if you go to Brazil, or whatever the case might be, it's the exact same thing. It's the exact same thing. The only difference is the people are different color, or whatever the case might be. But whoever is dominant, whatever is in any culture around the world, whatever is dominant, tends to give the non-dominant a very, very hard time, right? And this is where Christianity comes in, because Christianity plays the balance. It says men need to be men, but at the same time you need to be kind, and need to love thy neighbor and be decent to people, even if they're not like you, right? And treat everyone equal, like everyone has got equal value, and so on and so forth, right? And the reason why, we've moved away. One wonders if America was ever genuinely Christian, to be honest, with the way people behave today, and even historically have behaved, it's totally ridiculous, right? The certain things should have never happened. But they did. Why? Because people are stupid, right? And if you even look at Christians today, they don't live according to their religion at all. So that is true. So able-bodied. So also people tend to prefer able-bodied people than people with disabilities. People with disabilities have a hard time, but they don't have a hard time. But this is one of the idiotic things that people always throw. People with disabilities don't have a hard time because people are prejudiced. They have a hard time because they have a disability. That's why it's called a disability. Okay. It's ridiculous. So I've got Tourette's. I have a hard time because I have Tourette's, not because of what other people are doing. It's the damn Tourette's, you know. Moreover, the ideal dominant masculinity is generally unattainable for most men. This is true, but not the. Again, it's not the forget about that, right? It is true, right? So what, let's say, so we, again, like I explained before, you've got the social sexual hierarchy. All of the sexual morals and fences have been pulled up, and it's now a free-for-all. Today, the sexual world, the sexual market, is the law of the jungle. It's just one of those things because Christian morals have gone out the window, and the whole no sex before marriage and one woman per man, one man per woman doesn't exist anymore. So it's a free-for-all, right? And so women have, contrary to what they say, vote with their feet, and they go 80%, right? We found, again, I spoke about this before, 20% of the men get 80% of the women. It's just that simple, right? And so this then poses a problem, right? So in Christianity, this problem wouldn't have happened because if each man is not allowed to have sex until he's married, and then when he's married he only gets one woman, right? Then there would be enough men and women generally, and it's the same, so a woman doesn't have sex before marriage and she marries to only one man. This basically means that there's enough men and women to go around for everyone, right? And then people pair up according to the best that they can find and attain, and so on and so forth, right? But the modern situation, where it's basically law of the jungle, where we're basically behaving like animals, right? You find that men who are not alpha males or sigma males simply can't compete, and that causes a problem. So you have this modern phenomena. It's called they're called incels, so involuntarily celibate, right? Which basically means that they simply can't get women, right? Because all the women are chasing after the alphas and the sigmas, or the high-end beta males, right? Because people you see this around the internet a lot. Oh, you stupid beta male. The fact of the matter is that the vast majority of men are beta males. The vast majority, okay? And you get high-end beta males. So beta males who are, they're successful at work and stuff. It's basically most working class men, okay? And so you get the high-end beta males who, fairly successful, etc., can afford stuff. So they generally, they're all right with women and stuff like that. And then you get the sort of lower-end beta males going on to gamma, which then they really, really, really struggle in any way, shape, or form to get women. And you'll generally find that it's then these men who women then use and abuse. They're the guys who become friend-zoned, who then women tend to exploit, right? And they will do anything for a woman just to maybe one day, women become their Aphrodite, this unattainable, but maybe if I worship her enough, she'll notice me. And so yeah, that really is a problem. But the problem was created by leftism, by this new secular philosophy about what sex means and what marriage means and stuff like that. The marriage has been destroyed because of leftist ideology, because of New World secular ideology, right? If we went back to the Christian way, you wouldn't be seeing this at all, right? And then all the alphas that you find, what happens is all the alphas are getting this massive influx of women suddenly, and they start thinking they're gods. They start thinking they're wonderful, and then they become arrogant. They become narcissistic. It's because they think literally because the women are making them believe that, and so are other men, right? So the other men are, yeah, you the man, like a Donald Trump, for example. You the man, but you the boss, right? and so a man like that a man can't be in that kind of position for very long before he starts thinking, well, maybe I am God's gift to the universe, right? And so you start getting this narcissists and all that kind of stuff, and you will find that every time there's a Me Too, whatever the hell it is, right, it's always in those high-end realms of the world. It's always out of Hollywood or in politics and stuff like that. It generally is not the case on sort of the average everyday human experience, man. And so it's completely ridiculous. They're trying to fix a problem that this ideology created in the first place. Men who, oh yeah, all right. So yeah, men who depart from this narrow masculine conception by any dimension of diversity, race, sexual orientation, right, may find themselves negotiating between either adopting the dominant ideals that exclude them, or being stereotyped and marginalized, and that is true, right? That is true. So you find that a lot of people, because we have a world that is dysfunctional. The world is dysfunctional. Even the West. The West may be, on average, a better place to live than most other places in the world, but it doesn't mean it's not dysfunctional, right? It is dysfunctional, and a lot of people are finding that, certain things are preferred and other things are, and other types of people are completely and utterly excluded in general, right? And so this actually creates quite a lot of issues, and it's why you get kids like Columbine, like the Columbine shooters, right? They're a product of what these guys are actually talking about here. So a lot of people have been completely like, this guideline is absolute trash, but there is truth mixed in here, right? Although they're trying to, and that's the problem with having a falsehood mixed in with truth, because then the truth becomes like a Trojan horse for the garbage. Right. So yeah, what we find, and this is the thing, we find one of the things that people complain a lot about is how false people are. And one of the reasons is because of this, because people feel certain social pressures, and so they try to wear a mask of, they try to be something that they're not, and it does become an issue. When trying to understand the complex role of masculinity in the lives of diverse boys and men, and yeah, masculinity is being a man is not as easy as people think, right? Being a good, decent man, it's not as easy as people think, right? When you have responsibility is tough, man. It's really tough. You have to, and that's why you have to be stoic and not show emotions and be resilient and stuff like that, because it's tough. It really, really is tough to be a man, to have a wife and be It's like, I'm responsible. I'm the man of the house, and I've got someone that's relying on me, or I have children relying on me. That's tough, man. It's not just anyone that can do that, right? Which is why women go for men like that, right? It's not because society is just magically just saying, oh, this is what we want, Good, decent men are not the desirable man is not a product of society, right? He just is what he is, and society is like, I want that, right? Simple as that. It's like where this whole fat shaming movement and all that kind of stuff, and all these fat women are completely rebelling about the fact that no one wants to sleep with them. It's like, it's not society that's telling us to find you unattractive. We simply biologically find you unattractive, and there's not a damn thing we can do about it. You like what you like. End of story. You cannot unlike what you like. It's just that way, right? And what a lot of people don't understand, which is why there's no mention of biology here, because biology would explain most of this, right? When you're looking for a mate, there are certain, we are biologically designed to look for certain visual cues in the other person's physical appearance that actually tell you something about what that person's genetics are all about. As simple as that. Which is why which is why people who have like severe mental conditions and like brain damage or whatever the case might be, you can immediately see that these things are manifest on their face, right? You can see when a person is severely mentally retarded or whatever the case might be, right? Because the face and the body, it tells you a lot about what's going on inside the person genetically and all these kinds of things, right? And so we deviate from we reject that, not because we're trying to be cruel or unkind, but the fact of the matter is we're biologically predisposed to find the physical representation of the best genes that we can, and then to procreate with the best genes, because to populate and all that kind of stuff. It's just one of those things, man. Right. Heteronormative, oh, I hate this word. Heteronormative assumptions often falsely conflate sexual and masculine identity for men, as well as disregard sexual attraction and gender role adherence for those who identify as sexual minority, transgender, or gender non-conforming. Here's the problem, right? They are assuming that homosexual, that all of the LGBT, that is a normal, natural thing rather than an aberration. All right, and I know this is very politically incorrect and all that kind of stuff, but the fact of the matter is, what a lot of people don't seem to realize, right? Because here's the thing, they correctly acknowledge that certain types of men are excluded and rejected, okay? And they're saying, oh, LGBT people are excluded or all that kind of stuff, right? But here's what they don't seem to realize. Are the LGBT that way because they've been excluded? Or are they excluded because they're that way? Right? My argument is that LGBT people become that way because they were excluded and rejected as children, and they suffered trauma as children. So, for example, we all know that a woman who has a bad relationship with her father tends to become very, very attention-seeking of males, and becomes very promiscuous with males when she gets older. That's just one of those things, right? And so you can see the sign of a damaged woman is a woman who has an unhealthy relationship with men, is hypersexual and all these kinds of things, seeking male improvement and all that kind of thing, right? So why is it that no one assumes the same thing of gay men? That it is the same thing, but because gay men fit a typically female personality profile, right? So they're more agreeable, they're more extrovert, they're higher in neuroticism, that they're basically not responding to men in the same way that an abused woman responds to men. It's just oh, my phone. It makes perfect sense. So and no one ever talks about this, right? The assumption is they're just that way and we shouldn't reject them, rather than they are that way because they were rejected when they were children, because they didn't have a decent father, because their father was abusive, because the father rejected them, because they identified, because they have a more feminine characteristics. It doesn't mean they're gay, right? Because no one, it's one of the things that they get correct is that it is fluid, right? Because otherwise, if it wasn't fluid, if your sexual orientation wasn't fluid, then there would be no such thing as gay people. I mean, obviously, right? So part of the development, if the child who was a little bit more agreeable, a little bit more conscientious, a little bit more extrovert, which are typical female traits, a little bit more high in neuroticism, right, which are typically more female traits, if he's got a father that is not a particularly salient father, he's maybe a bit abusive, he's hypermasculine, and the child is afraid of his father for whatever reason, right, and he's got a mother, and so that means he will automatically identify more with his mother than with his father. So the masculine will forever remain a mystery to him, right? He doesn't identify with that. He will identify more with his mother. And if his mother is domineering, like you get the concept of the devouring mother, if the mother doesn't say, listen, son, go in and affirm his masculinity, right? Affirm his man. You can do it. You're a man, and you can go ahead and give him confidence, right? Try to make up for the rejection of his father. Then what you do is you find that these boys grow up identifying more with the female, and rather than the female being a mystery, because men, heterosexual men, the feminine is this mysterious thing that we subsequently eroticize and we go for. So then it happens differently for then the young boy, who then he associates more with the feminine, because he was rejected by his masculine father, or the father wasn't there, and because he's a little bit more shy and reserving, whatever. If he was then rejected by his other male peers and all that kind of stuff, the masculine then is a mysterious thing that is eroticized, and that's then what he then wants to go for. And in the same way that then a young woman who goes through sort of similar abusive experience becomes hyper male attention seeking, it becomes the same way with the homosexual, which is then explains when you look at the LGBT movement, right? They say they want acceptance, right? But they want more than acceptance. They want to be loved. They want to be loved. They're not just saying live and let live. No, they literally want to force people to accept them and embrace them and want them and love them and think that they're wonderful. And they're basically expressing a desire for something they never had as children, is basically what's going on. But, I'm not a psychologist. What the hell do I know, right? That's my theory. And and I've seen this time and time again. I've spoken to many homosexual people. I have homosexual people in my family, and that's exactly what it was like, man. A father who was not salient, a mother who was narcissistic and overbearing, and a brother, me, who was hyper masculine and aggressive and stuff like that, and who himself was not directed well, and so was aggressive and violent and uncaring and unloving. And it's gonna happen, man. It's gonna happen because it happened because a lot of people will be like, oh well, if that's true, then why did I not become gay but my brother did? And so the fact is, well, it's because my brother and I are different. We have different personality profiles. I'm more dominant than he is. I'm more disagreeable than he is, etc., etc. So he became wanting approval and wanting affection and wanting all these kinds of things, and me, I became, well, because I'm assertive, I became rebellious, I became criminal in a lot of ways, and so on and so forth. So it's the same abuse, but because of the different personalities, the results are different. So they're not going to get things right here. They're not going to get things right here at all. Expression of romantic or sexual attraction might present gay, bisexual, transgender, and gender non-conforming individuals with gender role-related conflict that is in part born from violations of heteronormative gender role ideals. That is true. Obviously, these people, and again, I emphasize, these people became that way because of the disconnect, and not the disconnect. They're not rejected because they are that way. They are that way because they were rejected. Okay, and it is a problem. It is a problem, and you even find, for example, how, let's say nowadays, if you get you get a man, like let's say if I take myself for example, if my wife and I had kids, and she earned more money than me, I'd be perfectly happy staying home and looking after kids. It would be no skin off my nose whatsoever. I'm a damn good cook, and so on and so forth, right? No problem, right? I'd go and I'd do stuff. I used to be an au pair back when I was living in South Africa. I au paired for several years. I get along well with kids. I got no issues. If my wife was earning more money, go ahead, right? And I know for a fact that people would look at me funny if that was the case, right? And I do agree that shouldn't necessarily be the case. However, it would not then and here's the thing, right? The roles might change, but certain roles do not. So even if I was a stay-at-home father, for example, I would still be the head of the home because I'm still more dominant and all that. I'm still masculine. You know what I'm saying? Just the role right? The role, what you do. Let's say if I put on an apron and go into the kitchen and start cooking, I'm not less masculine for it. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't mean that I can't then go and put on a pair of boxing gloves and go into the ring and have it out with someone. You know what I'm saying? If you can have that balance, and that's what we strive for. That's what I strive for. That's what every man should strive for, is to strive for the balance. If a man is hyper masculine, he should strive to be more gentle, more domestic. And if a man is very, very gentle, very domestic, he should strive to be a little bit more assertive and outgoing. And it's a part of balancing out the personality, right? And that's called maturity. That's called growing up, right? But people don't want that. They say, oh, you are the way you are and you must stay the way you are. Unless you are a real masculine man, right? They want, unless you're gay or like a gay man, you're toxic masculinity. And that's rubbish. You need an integration. So yeah, I don't think they know what the hell they're talking about. So yeah, from violations of heteronormative gender role ideals, and potentially alienate sexual and gender minority men from a complete male identity, right? And again, they do not have a complete male identity because they're like this because they were rejected as children, not because they were being rejected now. The fact that they're rejected now is a sign that we know more or less what masculinity should be, right? And we know that that's not it. And when you see, and here's the thing, when it comes to humans, we're a little bit hypocritical, because if we look in the animal kingdom and you see that animals tend to behave a certain way, and if you see an animal behaves in an aberrant way, you immediately recognize as an aberrant behavior. And you say, well, there's something not quite right there. And even the other animals will reject that particular individual, right? And so you look at humans and we're very like, oh, and here's the interesting thing. The secular world is all about science and right, and evolution and all these kinds of things. The fact of the matter is we're a bisexual species. We're a bisexual species, right? And as a result, the two genders are very, very different and complementary, right? And so naturally, if we see a male or a female that rejects the opposite, which is what they're biologically designed to not reject, we should immediately identify, well, there's a problem there, right? Why does that exist? What happened to make that way? But no one does that. They immediately say, oh, well, no, you have the right to be that way. And they completely ignore the fact that maybe this individual was injured in some way and they need, right? And so I agree that not only is the secular world completely doing it wrong, but Christians have completely done it wrong, right? Because even though the Bible does speak against homosexuality in very, very strong terms, no, we're not supposed to go and persecute them, pitchfork and stuff like that, right? Because if you persecute and pitchfork, that rejection, that's what got them to be that way in the first place, right? You're not going to fix the situation by doing more of the same, by doing more of what they experienced as children, that rejection, right? And that not affirming them in so the thing is, man, when it's like, if you want to ask why do Christians, why should a Christian have a problem with someone who's homosexual, for example? It's not even so much have a problem for, but in a way feel bad for the guy, right? It's because you don't have a woman in your life, man. That's a big deal. That's a really, really big deal, right? You're missing out on something, man. You are really, really missing out on something, and that's why, right? And that's how we should be dealing with this sort of thing. Have a totally different approach. So in a way, yeah, and understanding, like, what's going on there, man, and I've had a lot of gay friends, and I've lived with gay people and stuff like that, and you talk to them, and if you just treat them like human beings and just one-on-one, and I've got, and you see that there's more there, man. You really do. But in the world today, it's all about just being confrontational, and there's no more to it. But yeah, and the ideal would be to welcome them. Say, listen, you are a man. right? You are a man. Come into the fold, and that's why they became that way in the first place, right? Is because they were rejected, and we should instead say, dude, come in and see and experience and the joy of what it is to be a man, right? And all the different expressions of what it is to be a man, right? And we help each other balance each other out, right? As a proper community of men. But many people don't want to do that, right? It's like, accept me the way I am, or and it's like, no, sorry, you know. So when they say that we conflate gender and sexuality, it's like, we're not, right? If you're a male, you should like women, and if you're a woman, you should be sexually attracted to men, and if you're not, that has nothing to do with a gender role or whatever the case might be. Like, oh, a man, even though he can become a chef or can become a nurse or whatever, that's completely separate. That's completely separate issue. When you're talking about sex and stuff like that, that's a biologically and a psychological thing, and there's a problem there, right? Because we need that opposite from us. This may ostracize some gay, bisexual, transgender, and gender non-conforming individuals from an inherent sense of male identity. They are that way because they have a problem with male identity. That's why they're that way in the first place, leading to feeling pressure to adopt dominant masculine roles to reduce feelings of minority stress. Yeah, I can see that. People overcompensate. And even not just LGBT people. I've seen a lot of so I remember back when I was at school, a lot of boys who were less dominant would lie about their sexual exploits in order to be more accepted, right? And that represents a problem. That really does represent a problem, that people would want to lie and put on a false face in order to be more accepted. That is a problem, absolutely. Additionally, some sexual and gender minority individuals do not wish to label their gender identity and do not feel masculine behaviors are an essential component of male gender identity. And this is actually true. Now, this, I believe, actually supports my premise in the sense where they don't want to label themselves, and so if you take a caricature, the caricature is that women belong in the kitchen, right? That's the caricature. And so a lot of people feel, well, that's silly, right? Why can't a man be in the kitchen? And that's true. Men can be in the kitchen, women can be in the kitchen. The person in the kitchen, the role of the individual in the kitchen has nothing to do with the gender, with being masculine, with being male or female. That's got nothing to do. So they correctly identify that being a hairdresser or being a cook or being whatever or being a CEO has nothing to do with any of this, right? You can be masculine or feminine and go and do these things, right? So they feel, the mind in a simplistic way is like, if being masculine means I need to be a tree cutter, a wood chopper, and I don't want to be a wood chopper, then maybe I'm not masculine, maybe I'm not male, maybe I'm something else. You know what I'm saying? And this is wrong. It's like, and so in a sense, yeah, they've got something really, really, truly correct, right? And the fact that these individuals do not want to identify, they're expressing it wrong. It's like, you should identify as male regardless, and just say, well, I'm a male that likes fashion. I'm a straight male that likes fashion. There's nothing wrong with that, I mean, or I'm a straight male that likes to cook, or that likes to look after kids, or whatever the case might be. There's nothing wrong with that, right? But people, and in a lot of ways, that caricature of what it means to be a man is not only the fault of both men and women, but also the fault of these people as well, these activists and stuff like that set up this straw man of what it means to be masculine, right? It's a complete straw man. This toxic masculinity is a total, utter straw man, right? That's not what masculinity is at all, right? And they basically throw the baby out with the bathwater, in the sense where, like, if being masculine and all raping and abusing, and there's good traits in there like being assertive and stuff like that, well, then being assertive must be evil then as well. It's like, come on, throwing the baby out with the bathwater. Totally. Um, For these individuals, masculinity may be conceptualized as a set of characteristics that fall on a spectrum and are expressed differently from one individual to another, vary over the course of one's identity development, or may depend, let's move over, or may depend on context. Again, this is true. Now, if people understood personality, right, go and look at Big Five personality. If people understood personality, you would realize that there's no such thing, right, as gender, as a gender spectrum or gender whatever. It's not. Gender and sex are binary, male, female, right? Personality varies. Personality is different. All right, that's what's different. It's not the. It has nothing to do with being masculine or being feminine, or being or liking women or liking men or whatever. It's got nothing to do with that, right? The gender, sex, binary, XX, XY. That is it. That is it, and you cannot change it. You cannot change it, right? But the personality will be different. And what these people do not seem to realize is that the confusion is that personality is on a spectrum between men and women. Society prefers people who fall on one end of the personality spectrum. They incorrectly identify that corner of the spectrum, of the personality spectrum, as that is the only desirable thing for men, and that is the only desirable thing for women. And basically people that fall on the other points of the personality spectrum then feel rejected and then have a problem, and then incorrectly, instead of saying this is just a personality thing, incorrectly believe that it has something to do with sex and gender. Although the cultural and societal pressures to endorse, conform to, and perform dominant masculinity are considerable, men still have agency and can part from dominant ideals. Well, duh, obviously, right? Just have to look at Sigma males. They do it all the time. You know, they stand outside their social structure and they say, no, I'm not going to do that. People do it all the time. People rebel all the time, right? So, yeah, fair enough. Men not meeting dominant expectations often create their own communities within which they develop cultural standards, norms, and values that may depart from dominant masculinity. And this is where video games... so this is absolutely true. This is absolutely true. So basically men who were not the jocks, the football players, the basketball players, the womanizers and all that kind of stuff, what did they do? They invented Dungeons and Dragons. They invented computer games. They invented a whole bunch of other stuff, right? So you've got comic books, you've got Comic-Con. They invented something completely different. They invented computers. They invented all these kinds of things. So these guys were part of one dominance hierarchy, which is based on physical prowess, whether you're an MMA fighter or a footballer or whatever the case might be, right? Or a businessman or whatever the case might be. And then these guys, they just developed, all they did, right, which is exactly what they did, is because men are adventurous, right? Because they are adventurous and assertive and pioneering, these men that didn't conform to those, they went off and they developed a completely new dominance hierarchy. And you get many dominance hierarchies in the world, you know, so, and they form hobbies and things like that. And that's what these men went and did, right? And in those days, right, back in the day when these things were invented, these men would just be like, well, we don't identify with that, fair enough, we're going to go do this. And at no point did they sit there and think, well, maybe I'm gay, maybe I'm transgender. No, they just realized it was a difference in personality, so they went and did something else that was part of their personality. They mastered it, turned it into a culture, and hey presto. Now everyone today, right, once upon a time, if you were a comic book reader, you were a nerd, idiot, you suck, right? Nowadays, Marvel, everyone knows Marvel, everyone knows DC, and ad nauseum, they're bringing out movies and series and stuff like that based on comic book universe. Everyone suddenly loves comic books, right? This stuff has been around for like 100 years almost, and now suddenly comic books are wonderful, right? These things change, and there's nothing wrong with that. You don't have to now go and say that because I don't identify with whatever, that now suddenly I'm gay or transgender, whatever the case might be. Those represent the LGBT represents sort of that rejection, but men who've completely utterly were destroyed and demolished in some way, and had some real severe problems growing up, or and so on and so forth, right? And also because the culture, and here's the problem with it, right? It probably would have never occurred to most of them to be LGBT if they didn't have a culture that was constantly bashing this over everyone's head. And so now think about, what are they going to do with pedophiles? Should we now accept them as well? Of course not. We acknowledge the fact that if a man is attracted to a prepubescent child, that there's something wrong with him. Right? So certain biological norms and standards are there for a good reason. So these people are the ones, they say, oh, that heteronormative people, they conflate things. Listen, these guys are the ones. They're the ones conflating things. Often create their own communities. Yeah, they do create their own communities. And guess what? Feminism goes and destroys them. Goes and destroys those communities. Look at the Boy Scouts and all that, men in Australia. Look at men's sheds and stuff like that. Feminists are completely destroying it. They say men are not allowed to have their own things at all, because it's sexist for men to have their own things. So again, the problem is being created by feminists, by this idiotic, retarded ideology. For instance, in racial and ethnic, youth, or gay communities, boys and men may develop forms of resistance in action and attitudes that challenge the expectations of dominant masculinity, such as that of the cool pose by African American men. As far as I'm concerned, that's just a manifestation of narcissism, to be honest. This cool pose, this, always this gangster poses. It's like that's not a healthy thing. And again, it makes sense that was. And here's the weird thing: everyone, we need to accept that as black identity, rather than realize, as they're realizing but not saying, that was born out of an identity crisis, right? And you see that the black community in the States in general is having a massive identity crisis. Who are we? Are we rap? Are we this? Are we that? They don't identify with Africans, even though a lot of them pretentiously like to dress up like Africans and stuff like that. And the problem, here's the thing, right? African American. There's the problem, right? Why are blacks having an identity crisis? They're having an identity crisis because of identity politics, right? African American. That African word should be eliminated. That should go. It should just be, dear black people, you want to know what you are? You're an American. That's it. Like everyone else. There's your identity. You don't have to go and learn Swahili to be someone. Suddenly Swahili is the language of the gods, right? You're American. And if you're in South Africa, born and raised, you're South African. It's that simple. You don't need this other stuff. Forget what these social justice people are telling you. You're an American. End of story, right? And even me, right? It's like people are like, you were born in Brazil, you live in the UK, you lived in South Africa. Yeah, sure, I should have this horrible identity crisis. I don't care. You want to call me Brazilian? You want to call me British? So what? Who cares, right? A real man is not going to worry about those things. I am who I am. I'm a good husband, hopefully. Right? I'm a good husband. I go and I make my money. I do my thing. I've got my religion. I've got my worldviews. I'm my own person, man. Right? And that's it. I don't need to be these things. And this is the problem, right? These psychologists, these people, this leftist movement, they're the ones creating the identity crisis by saying you have to identify with something here and there. It's like, no, just be your own damn person. Just be your own person, man. Forget about all of that. or the engagement of John Henryism. Now, John Henryism is a condition whereby they say that black Americans, they work themselves almost to death in order to try and come right in life and all that kind of stuff. Now again, African this John Henryism is a lot of garbage, because the simple fact of the matter is that if you man, what is the word? If you account or adjust for conscientiousness, subtrate industriousness, then John Henryism disappears right out of the window, right? Men who are highly industrious, whether they're white, whether they're black, they will all qualify for John Henryism, right? Which is why so many people who are highly business oriented people, after a while their health goes. They end up in hospital, they die young, whatever the case might be. They look wretched, they turn to drugs, alcohol to try and keep themselves going. A lot of people will think, oh, I want to be a CEO, I want to be whatever, and stuff like that. It's like, no, those people literally work themselves into the grave. So this idea that it's just with African American men, it's rubbish. The African American men, they're trying so hard to be accepted that they work themselves to the point where they have health issues, and they went and they measured blood pressures and stuff like that. And it's like, no, if you adjust for personality profiles, all of that will go away, because an African American guy who's got he's in like that 5th percentile of conscientiousness, there's no ways he's going to work himself to a psychological hysteria. Not a chance, right? And it's the same for whites and Mexicans and whatever the hell else. It's, adjust for personality, then the variables vanish. So although such adaptations challenge hegemonic masculinity, they often carry with them significant problems of their own. These adaptations do not challenge hegemonic masculinity, first of all, because hegemonic masculinity is basically a manifestation of the same personality traits that the men that do this would. So no, it doesn't actually do it at all. And they often carry with them significant problems of their own, yes, because people then basically work themselves to death. They have no family life, etc., etc. Again, it's about balance. So that's garbage. I don't know. For example, despite evidence indicating that African American men engage in John Henryism, the long-term effects of these behaviors may be detrimental to health and well-being. Further, despite ethnic minority boys and men's engagement in positive behaviors, they may be stereotyped and subject to labeling by educators, law enforcement, and mental health professionals as aggressive or hypermasculine. For instance, Goff, Jackson, demonstrate how African American boys are more likely to be perceived as older, less innocent, more responsible for their actions, and being more appropriate targets for police violence. Now, this is absolute, utter garbage, and let me explain to you why. This is not only true for African American men, but for Latinos. We get we often, and I've experienced this, where you find that people think you're older than you are, and so on and so forth. The reason for that has nothing to do with how society is forcing and stereotyped and Again, generalizations and stereotypes are informed by observation, and what is observed is a manifestation of biological things and circumstances. So, for example, it is an absolute fact that African, and I've experienced this even as a Latino boy moving to South Africa, I got along better with black people than I did with white people, because I used to find that the white people were a bit namby-pamby and all that kind of stuff. And the reason for that is that if your life is if you have a difficult life, an underprivileged life, you're going to mature and grow up faster than someone who is more sheltered and shielded from the world, right? The difference, and this just also comes down to different parenting techniques. For example, Latino and African American parents, they hold their children responsible for their actions more than what white parents do. So, for example, white parents basically let their children get away with almost whatever the hell they want, okay? So that's it, really, right? Whereas in Latino and African American families, our mothers, they'll give you, we're afraid of our mothers, man. Right? Out comes the belt or the wooden spoon, and right? So you will develop differently to someone who's you will develop differently from someone who's mollycoddled all the time. Okay? And so naturally, if your parents treat you in a more aggressive manner by giving you hidings and harsh discipline and stuff like that, what's going to happen? You're going to grow up to not only be a little bit more, you're not only going to mature faster and be less innocent because you're exposed to many harsh realities in the world. So you will actually be less innocent, but you will also be generally more aggressive because you were taught by your parents that to respond with aggression. And that's the truth, man. And as a Latino guy, I can tell you straight up, man, that's the case. That's the case, man. So this has nothing to do with white people stereotyping us. It's we're actually like that, and the white people are just reacting because of what they see. And the difference needs to happen internally, right? First of all, white people need to stop mollycoddling this helicopter parenting stupidity. Need to stop that, like yesterday, right? Stop mollycoddling your children, first of all. But second of all, African and Latino parents need to stop being so aggressive to their children. Need to stop beating the hell out of their children, because they do, right? Latino and African American parents, our cultures, we beat the hell out of our children, right? To the point of bruising and drawing blood and stuff like that. I've had it happen to me, right? And I'm not downing my parents or anything like that, you know, stuff like that, you know. I mean, a lot of the times I deserved it, right? But that does, you know, I'm still not entirely convinced that hidings are streng verboten, right? Or completely ultimately forbidden, right? I still believe that maybe a little bit spanking might be in order, right? Because spanking does teach you that out in the real world, physical violence is a reality, right? But as with anything, it can be completely and utterly overdone. I mean, if you pull up a leather belt or a wooden spoon or a wooden rolling pin, that's too much, right? That's just downright abuse. Okay, that's downright abuse. Absolutely mad. That's why most men experience pressures to conform to hegemonic masculinity. That's true. Some men, particularly those from marginalized groups, may be targets of gendered, racial, and heterosexist stereotypes. Yes and no, but it's more subtle than what the ideology. They're not being subtle about it in the slightest. It's completely silly. So application, basically, psychologists are encouraged to expand their knowledge about diverse masculinities and to help boys and men and those who have contact with them, teachers, coaches, religious leaders, and become aware of how masculinity is defined in the context of their life circumstances. I partially agree, but psychologists go and study personality profiles, forget about all the identity politics garbage, and look at the person as an individual, right? Psychologists aspire to help boys and men over their lifetimes navigate restrictive definitions of their own masculinity to create their concepts of what it means to be male, although it should emphasize that expression of masculine gender norms may not be seen as essential for those who hold a male gender identity. So yes, you know, for sure. But at the same time, the psychologist, so what I would instead say to psychologists is rather look at personality profiles, personality traits and stuff like that first of all, so that you know who the individual is, and then you see their strengths and weaknesses, right? So if a person is overly agreeable, help him to learn how to be a little bit more disagreeable and a little bit more assertive, because that'll help him in the long run, right? Because that person will be taken advantage of even by their own family members, okay? And if a person is too assertive, right? So find out who the person is in the personality, help them balance out their personality wherever they're deficient, right? Affirm their strengths, right? Work on their weaknesses, and allow the individual to go and deal with the environment in his own damn way. Let him do it himself. Don't go try to dictate this garbage to them, right? Let him go and sort it. Give him the tools, the personality, the internal resources, right? And then let him go and make a life for himself in his own way. Simple as that. Simple as that. I'm not going to bother with the rest because it's going to be a lot of garbage. Anyway, ladies and gentlemen, I hope this helped you out. That was Guideline 1. Thank you for watching, and God bless you. Cheerio, and take it easy.